So for these gouache paintings, I'm using a mixed media paper with a vellum surface, so it's a little smoother. It's heavier stock, so it won't warp under the gouache. And in order to transfer my four-way repeat onto this paper, I have traced it on tracing paper. And then on the back of the tracing paper, I've drawn with a 6B graphite, just put down a layer of graphite. I have then gone back and traced over all of my lines so that my drawing transfers over to my mixed media paper. I want to make sure that I know where the edges of my painting are going to be, so I went ahead and drew a 5x5 square onto my mixed media paper so that I could align my tracing paper to that with each drawing. And I've done this about 4 times, so I have the repeat drawn out and ready to paint. In terms of supplies, obviously you're going to need gouache. For our purposes, we're going to stick with primaries plus white and black. I have ultramarine blue, lemon yellow, and brilliant red, but you could use any combination of red, yellow, and blue. You're also going to want some brushes. I have a variety of brushes, all different styles and brush points, but these are all soft brushes, good for watercolor, no hard bristles. You'll also want a container of water and a rag for cleaning your brushes, as well as some sort of palette. I'm going to use wax paper that I'll tape to my table, but you could use a regular palette paper, or even a Tupperware container, as long as it has a nice flat bottom that's going to be large enough to paint on. Last thing about setup is that you're going to want to set your palette, brushes, and water on the side where your dominant hand is so that you're not reaching across your painting and maybe dripping water or wet paint over your image. And now we're ready to get started painting. For the purpose of this exercise, I have used a photograph to identify some colors that I want to try and match in this abstract design. I'm going to start by establishing my palette on my paper. I think I'll start with the blue. So I'm going to get my brush a little wet and then pick up some blue. This blue from this image is definitely a tint, and I feel like it's almost like a pure blue. There's not too much red or yellow in it, so I'll just take some blue, add a little bit of white to it, and you'll notice that I'm adding the white to the side and slowly adding a little bit more blue in. I don't want to combine the colors too fast and then end up with a color that is much darker than what I want, but I think this blue is good. Now I'm going to thoroughly wash my brush and then move on to the next color. I'm going to try out the yellow next. So looking at this yellow, it definitely is a warm yellow, so it has some red in it. So again, I'm going to lay down my yellow first and slowly add a little bit of red to it. Definitely added too much red to start, so I need to go back in and add some yellow. Again, I'm always kind of leaving a little bit of the first color that I mixed on the palette, so I'm not mixing everything into my new color. This is obviously a tint, so I'm adding in some white until I have that right shade of yellow. So next I want to get these 2 earth tones in. I'm going to start with the darker one. It took me a long time to get this color, so I've speeded up the video, but we're using a little bit of all 3 primaries and some white. I definitely made this too light to start, and it took me a while to get it back to the value that I wanted it to, but I identified this as a warm brown, so definitely some of all 3 primaries, but more red and blue than yellow in this one. The next earth tone is just slightly lighter in value, but pretty close to the same color. So I'm just going to change the color slightly, make it a lighter tint, and then I'll end up with a color that I'm pretty happy with. And the last color to mix is the green. This is definitely a shade. I wouldn't put any white in this. So I'm just going to mix my green and then add a tiny bit of black. A little bit goes a long way, so you don't need a lot. And then we have our green. And now I'm ready to start painting. So keeping in mind the kind of ratios of pigment that I use to mix each of these colors, I'm going to go back through and just paint color flats into the geometric shapes of my design. I'm switching up my brush depending on the areas that I'm making, trying to keep my paint not too watery, but also not too thick, just an even consistency. You'll notice that I started out by painting a few of the dark green shapes and then switched over to the lighter blue. It's definitely easier to paint dark over light than light over dark, so I recommend starting with your lighter colors first and then working towards your darker colors. I'm going to repeat this process with each of the different pattern sections that I've drawn out. Each section is obviously the same design, but I'm going to switch up my color palette every time so that by the end I'll have several different colorways for this pattern, and I'll be able to see how changing the color affects the mood and the overall visual patterning of this design.